Welcome to the Jacksonville First Seventh-day Adventist Church podcast, where we listen, learn, and love together. We hope you enjoy this inspiring message.
So we're going to be talking about a very embarrassing topic tonight, but I address it by talking about brain chemicals, so I don't want anybody to panic, okay? I've done this many times. As we have discussed previously, we are taking the life timeline section by section. And what we are learning, if I could just sort of summarize and set the tone here, is that at every point of human development, God builds in us a capacity to love and be loved. That's the whole point of life. It's a learning journey where we continue to build our capacity, our ability to love and be loved, until we're the most loving people of all at the end of our lives, and we have a PhD and we're grandparents. Either that or we're old and crabby because we didn't follow God's plan. But what we're going to see is that this is God's plan, is that we learn how to love and be loved. And what happens is he literally formats the brain for love. He teaches us skill sets like trusting and negotiating and resolving conflict. And each stage builds on the last stage's set of skills, so that life, at least theoretically, and in Jesus, can be a series of learning experiences that deepen our ability to love one another. Can I get an amen? And that's what it's all about. People look at the law of God and they think, oh, it's a list of rules. No, it's not. It's a document that tells us how love works. And God is trying to train us to love. That's the whole point of life. So the phase that we're at in our journey through the life timeline is the point where we've developed a relationship with our folks, we've developed a relationship with our siblings, we've developed friendships, and now it's time to choose a life partner. I want to talk to you about sexuality in the context of this, and I'm going to refer to a study done by a man named J.D. Unwin. J.D. Unwin, sorry he's smoking. Everybody smoked back then. He was in the 1900s, but they thought it was good for them, so kind of overlooked that. He studied 80 primitive tribes and 6 known civilizations through 5,000 years of history and claimed that there was a positive correlation between cultural achievement and people restraining their sexuality, meaning people not acting out on sexuality like animals, people keeping it within the confines of marriage and being faithful to one spouse, for instance. That's a form of restrained sexuality. Now, he wasn't doing this to try to prove the Bible true. He was actually Freudian, and Freud promoted the idea that restraint on sexuality was a good thing. And so J.D. Unwin was testing that theory. Nevertheless, Freud wasn't wrong about everything. And he showed that the more restraint on sexuality, the more the culture ascended, the more the culture prospered educationally, creatively, and in other ways. And I find that fascinating because what it's telling me is that the Bible is not the only place where we see God's law written, so to speak. It bears itself out in the natural realm. We can see God's principles in the form of what happens when we break those principles and the consequences that come to us, or when we obey those principles and the blessings that come to us. So we see God's plan both in the positive and in the negative through consequences in the natural realm, see? So I love that. It's called moral philosophy or natural theology, to study those kinds of things. In the U.S., the percentage of children born out of wedlock has risen from 10.7% in 1970 to 41% in 2010. So what kind of a track are we on in Western civilization morally, especially as pertains to sexual morality? Do you think we're on an ascent or on a descent? We're on a descent. Now, we're still relatively prosperous financially, economically, educationally. The United States is still the place to go for graduate school globally. Not saying we're doing that great with elementary, but we're still kind of the gold standard for graduate school in many people's minds anyway. But my thinking, our culture is now built on a foundation that the forefathers built. And what we're doing by compromising these principles of morality is we're eating away at the foundation. And there will come a point where everything crumbles. It hasn't crumbled yet. But when it crumbles, we're going to be in a very dire situation, and some extreme measures are going to be taken. We can see that in the book of Revelation, how people will try to make a do for what they've brought upon themselves in society. So obviously, sexuality is a powerful thing. I can remember a couple of stories. I've shared one with you already, but you're going to think I'm a real pyromaniac when I share this one. But I've had a couple of experiences with fire. There was a particular day, my husband, I thought it had emptied the wood stove that we had in our house the night before, but actually he'd emptied it that morning. And I took the ashes and the coals and I dumped it in the backyard, thinking it was all, burned out. And then I'm just prattling around the house, and I look out the window into the backyard, and I see these people with like yellow suits on, like walking around my backyard. And I'm like, who do those people think they are, I was like, whatever, have at it. And then I walk into the living room, and there's this like big truck parked in front of my house. And I'm like, what's going on here? And all of a sudden I realized I lit my backyard on fire, and they were putting the fire out. So what had happened was the coals had lit the trees, and you know the rest of the story. Fire is a very powerful thing. I mentioned to you guys, I think, did I tell you about when I was 12? I told you that story, right? I forget what stories I tell people, but fire is very powerful. But here's the thing about fire is we need it to survive, don't we? How well would we do if fire in the form of the sun ceased to exist right this moment? How well would we do? How long would we live? Well, first of all, we would instantly freeze. You think this is cold? That would be really cold. We'd instantly freeze. But even if that didn't happen, the sun, fire in the form of the sun, grows our what? Food, so that we can eat and sustain life. So we need fire to live. Fire is necessary for human life. But that very same fire that brings life within boundaries, if allowed to rage outside of boundaries, brings what? And human sexuality is exactly the same. We cannot live as a race collectively without sexuality, because that's our means of what? Procreation, continuing the race. Now, it doesn't mean that each individual person will die without sex, although young males feel like they will, but people don't. There are no gravestones with that written on them. And so that's not the case, but to sustain the human race, we have to have human sexuality. And so God gives life to the human race through sexuality, but that same sexuality, if allowed to rage outside of boundaries, brings what? Brings death. And you know the story, the STDs, but not just the physical diseases that are brought upon people. I went through, I'll tell you at the end of the presentation about a relationship I had in high school. And a relatively tame situation still affected me so profoundly and really messed with me emotionally in terms of my mental health. And recently I read a story about how a high school crush can lay the foundation for a lifelong struggle with depression. So letting these things rage outside of boundaries is a very high risk endeavor. When we look at the scriptures, a cursory reading of the scriptures may lead us to believe that God is a prude and that he has some kind of beef with human sexuality generally. Because there's a very restricted view of human sexuality in the scriptures. There are only very specific conditions in which sexuality is supposed to be expressed in terms of sexual intimacy. And if it is expressed outside of those very specific conditions, it is called a what? A sin, right? So God has very strong moral boundaries on human sexuality. We may be inclined, and indeed the world is inclined, to interpret that as God being some kind of killjoy, anti-pleasure, a prude, or whatever, as if he has something against sexuality. And actually, nothing could be what? Further from the truth. God has such a high regard of this sexuality that he himself created, that he uses it as a symbol for his love for the church. Listen to this verse. Husbands, love your wives. just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. Please don't be mad at me. I've had social media hate thrown at me for this, but I do believe that there could be a metaphor in the sexual act itself of that giving up process, because there is a giving up from the man's body to the woman's. So take that to the bank if you want to. If you don't, it's okay. But to me, there's a symbol there. He gave himself up for her that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. This mystery is great, but I am speaking concerning what? Christ and the church. So the marriage is a symbol of Christ's love for the church, and certainly sexuality, according to God's plan, is part of marriage. So this is a very beautiful thing, amen? We see this also in Revelation chapter 3. Jesus says, behold, I stand at the door and what? Knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, speaking to his church here, he's saying open so that I can come in. If any man open the door, I will come into him and will sup with him. That's a term of intimacy. I will eat with him. I will have this involvement with him and he with me. That verse in Revelation chapter 3 is thought to be a parallel to Song of Solomon chapter 5 and verse 2, which I'll read in a moment. But let me say that Song of Solomon is a book considered so erotic. It was considered so erotic that Jewish boys were not permitted to read it until they were 30. And here's what it says, and you'll see the similar language. It says, I sleep, but my heart is awake. It is the voice of my beloved. He knocks, saying, open for me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one. So you get my point that God isn't squeamish about sexuality at all. He loves it. He created it. There's a specific context for it, but that's only so that we can enjoy it in a fuller and more complete way. Amen? So because it's so powerful to symbolize the love of Christ, the devil is on the warpath against it. Have you noticed? And he's going to try to destroy it any which way he can. And one of the main ways that he destroys sexuality is by leading people into sexual addiction. And so I want to talk about that, and I'm just going to talk about it from a brain chemistry standpoint. There are two basic brain chemicals that are involved in kind of, if I could call it, a dance. I know Seventh-day Adventists don't dance, but anyway, there is a dance going on between these two brain chemicals, dopamine and oxytocin. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and it mediates the pleasure experience. So whenever you have an ice cream cone or see a beautiful sunset, even when you look in someone's eyes, you know, I'll tell you something interesting about dopamine. I have those two little teacup dogs that I've been showing you pictures of. I'm like a doting grandmother, and I have these dogs. It's pathetic, but I don't have any grandchildren yet, so whatever. So I have these cute little teacup dogs, and I go out and get them on the leash. And I don't know if you guys ever experienced this, but I get them on the leash, and I try to bring them in the house, and they're squirming around, and I squeeze them. Do you ever see something so cute you want to squeeze it? Have you ever had that happen? It's got a name. It's called cuteness aggression. And it's thought to be caused by the cuteness of the animal boosting brain dopamine so quickly that you have to do something to tamp it down, kind of. That's one theory as to why people get this cuteness aggression thing. So dopamine is very powerful, and it responds to anything cute, you know, anything beautiful, anything pleasurable. That's dopamine. Oxytocin is basically a hormone that helps people bond. And I talked a little bit about oxytocin previously when I was talking about mothering and breastfeeding and all this kind of thing. And I told you that there was a drug, ecstasy, that kids take, people take when they're getting high, and they end up, because it boosts their oxytocin, they end up crying and hugging each other. It's called the love drug. So that's oxytocin, very powerful stuff. And there's a dance between these two chemicals in your brain in sexuality. And basically what God wants is for us to have intense pleasure, but in the context of close bonding. And what we find is when those two things are working in concert with one another, both of them work better than if they're trying to work alone. So you might say in one way that dopamine is about lust, but oxytocin is about relationship. And so that sexual passion works much better in the context of a relationship. And it actually facilitates a relationship very powerfully. Because these brain chemicals are so powerful, they can lead to addiction. So I want to talk to you about how some of that happens. Each and every one of us has a reward-seeking system. Something in the brain that is dopamine related that makes us want to go in pursuit of things that are pleasurable. You know, we want to try to find breakfast, and then we're finding lunch a few hours later, and we're looking for something fun to do. And that's called a seeking system. And that, of course, is very involved in finding a life partner, finding someone you could be attracted to. You're seeking for that pleasurable, emotionally intense experience. That reward-seeking system is a God-given thing. There's nothing innately wrong with it. It's ultimately designed to lead us to seek God, in whom are our highest pleasures. I don't know if you've ever been in worship with God, you know, singing that beautiful song you just sang. It does something to the human heart. And when you can get to that place where it's just you and you're locked in with God or with a body of people and you're just in a state of awe and worship, that's pleasure. And that's a high pleasure. That reward-seeking system was designed to give us the ultimate pleasure, which is communion with God. But that happens according to God's will and within God's boundaries and principles. What the enemy is constantly trying to get us to do is expend those brain chemicals so that they are not utilized to drive us toward God. And so what happens with addiction basically is that some pleasures overload the system. So for instance, that excess dopamine will override what we call satiation mechanisms. Something called delta phos-B builds up in the neural circuits and causes a dulling of the pleasure response. And so that means that you need more of the same stimulant to get the same high. They call it desensitization or tolerance. What does that sound like? It sounds like drug addiction, right? I mean, if you're taking crack cocaine, not that I recommend this, don't try this at home, but if someone is taking crack cocaine, they do the first dose of crack and they totally overwhelm and expend their dopamine supply. And then what the individual does is tries to recover that high. They're like, whoa, I want to go back there. But they've exhausted their brain's ability to experience that high, so they're constantly seeking that high again, and they never get it. And finally, they're what? They're addicted. That's right. It's pathetic. So here's the thing, is that notice the OPA in dopamine, same as opiates. You have an internal heroin. Did you know that? Your brain produces its own heroin, and you can become addicted to that self-produced heroin. And that's what happens with sexual addiction. So let's look at a statement here from Tim Clinton. He says the brain develops a tolerance for naturally occurring opiates. And then he goes on to share something really powerful. He says, though dopamine may be the hormone that creates the instinctive pleasure of love and attachment, it is oxytocin that makes it possible for that pleasure to last for longer periods of time. So if oxytocin symbolizes a bonded relationship, and dopamine symbolizes, in a sense, the pleasure we experience within that bonded relationship, having that bond makes the pleasure last longer. It makes me think of Jesus telling us that at your right hand are what? Pleasures forevermore. So here's a beautiful thing. Your brain produces something called prolactin. See, God is constantly at work in human neurology to create as many chemical incentives to do the right things as possible. I was telling you about vasopressin and how men aren't as testosterone driven when their wives get pregnant because their vasopressin goes up. What God is doing there is trying to get nature to help us be obedient as much as possible. So here's another example of that. Prolactin is something your brain produces when you're very, very satisfied. You've just had a nice big dinner. You've had a powerful sexual encounter. Anything that's pleasurable and satisfying. A baby that's mother's breast. There's lots of high levels of prolactin. What they've done is they have measured the levels of prolactin in a person who is in a bonded relationship and has a sexual experience. and then someone who has a solo sexual experience, such as we would experience in pornography, masturbation, this type of thing. 400% higher in the context of a bonded relationship. That's what God is doing there, is he's making it more satisfying when you experience it within boundaries. That's the simple version of this story. It's going to satisfy you more thoroughly when it's according to God's plan. But if you experience sexuality outside of God's plan, there's always going to be this hunger that isn't quite satisfied. And what that does is it sets you up for excess, because you go in search of that hunger being satisfied, but the way you're doing it is making that impossible. And I think this is true of every form of sexual deviancy under the sun. And you know what? God is a creator. Satan is not a creator. Satan is a deviator. And so he'll take sexuality and he'll steer it out of God's course, and he'll come up with a new deviation every day of human history from now until Jesus comes again. He'll always be coming up with something new. So the devil is not original. But those deviations do not satisfy the way God's original plan satisfies, and therefore we get set up for sexual excess and ultimately addiction. Does that make sense? Yeah. You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. So I've looked at a lot of research about saving sex for marriage. And a lot of the research actually comes out of Brigham Young University. Do you guys know what religion that is? The Mormons, that's right. And Mormons are very pro-family. They want, the nuclear family. They believe in it. And so they put a lot of money behind doing this research to validate these kinds of things, family life. And I've taken most of these studies from there and found that people overall have better sexual experiences when they save sex for marriage. They tend to have more stable marriages, higher levels of satisfaction, and better communication when they wait to have sex within marriage. And they tend to have better health and better mental health. So is God trying to take something really valuable and wonderful away from us? Is he trying to kill our buzz here? Or is he trying to just preserve us and give us as much pleasure as we can possibly hold this side of eternity? Solomon had every pleasure a man could want. He had 700 concubines and 300 wives, or was it the other way around? I always forget, but 1,000 women. But what happened was Solomon lost the ability to experience pleasure so that he could have had 1,000 more women. It wouldn't have made any difference, because we are limited in our ability to experience pleasure by our own mortal bodies and the brain chemistry that we have as a result of that. And so when we expend that ability to experience pleasure, it doesn't matter what we do. It doesn't satisfy after a certain point. And you guys have, of course, heard the Rolling Stones song, "I Can't Get No Satisfaction." How true, amen? Well, hopefully you haven't heard the song, but whatever. So let's talk about forming this relationship, and I'm just going to touch on this for any young people that might be here. And I'm going to share my testimony of kind of this journey of my life in, partnership and, some of the things I went through in high school. Well, let me share that right now. When I was in high school, I had none of these kind of guidelines, none of this kind of revelation, and really very little instruction on morality and so forth. Wasn't raised in a real serious Christian home, although we did attend church. My dad did lecture me and tell me, he used the expression, "Don't sow your wild oats until you're married." And my dad told me that he had been told by his father that he should go, try out a few partnerships before he settled down. But my dad chose not to. And he married my mom, first partner he'd ever had. So my dad gave me that lecture. And, it was impressive, I have to admit. But he didn't really give me a motive for it. And when we tell people what to do without giving them the right incentive, the right motivation to do it, then we're really kind of robbing them of the ability to get there, so to speak. And I was in a very different environment. The world had changed a lot from the time he was a kid. And my high school was pretty insane. Like, they had a smoking lounge for the students in my high school. I remember there was what's that?
Were you hippie? Sorry.
No, it wasn't an Adventist school. Yeah, I was pretty much of a hippie. Everybody was at that point. But yeah, they had a smoking lounge, and you were allowed to wear shorts. You could wear just about anything you wanted. And you know, the whole modesty thing, I mean, I don't know, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but anyway, what'd you say? So, I'm already bearing my soul. So, I was kind of a wallflower. My best friend had moved away, and I went to this huge high school. Oprah Winfrey was bussed into the high school that I went to in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. 2,500 students is huge, and my best friend was gone, and I was just like this wallflower. I didn't have any friends or anything. But then I went on a ski trip, and I met, and I always have to sigh before I say his name, Rick. And he was like one of the gorgeous, you know, Prince Charmings of my class, and he had just about every girlfriend that you could possibly have in that whole class. And I went to a high school that was largely Jewish kids. And you know the thing about them being the chosen race? It's true. They were smarter, they were better looking, they were better athletes overall. They were incredible. So all of these girls that Rick had dated, Rick himself was Jewish, all of these girls that he had dated were just beautiful, and I just felt so intimidated by them. And he'd gone through pretty much all of them. Well, I was on a ski trip, and he and I ended up sitting next to each other on the bus, and we started talking, and we just really got along, really got to be, you know, conversant and so forth. So we hung out a lot on that weekend, and then I got back to high school, and I thought it was over. It was just never, you know, he won't have time for me. He's so popular and everything. But I remember praying. You know, a lot of people pray in algebra class, and I remember praying in algebra class that I would pass algebra, but also that Rick would pay attention to me. And I made this little tiny origami bird, and I went up to him and put it in his hand, and I just thought, no, this is hopeless, you know. But what had happened was he was dating a girl, but he had developed a crush on me, so he went to the girl, and he said, like, I met this other girl that I think I like better than you. Is that okay? And she was like, fine with it. This is high school. So she was okay. So I ended up dating this guy, Rick, and all of the Jewish girls, we called them Jewish American princesses because they were just beautiful. So all the Jewish girls kept coming up to me and going, so, you're dating Rick Hagan? Mm-hmm. Okay. I was like, yeah. It was really weird. But we dated a total of 3 years in high school, so it was way too much, way too soon, way too fast. And the first time he broke up with me, I was so shattered, and I'm absolutely certain that my struggle with depression stemmed to some degree back to that experience, because I had built my life around him, hadn't really stayed in touch with my girlfriends, and then I lose that relationship. I have no one. It was really a lonely time. And I remember reaching out to God in my heart, not knowing much about him. But then Rick and I ended up back together, and then I dumped him the second time. So, you know, I wasn't trying to take revenge on him or anything, but it was weird to me because I thought I would, based on the intensity of my feelings for this young man, I thought I would feel that way forever. But that dopamine is an expendable supply. And I remember noticing that I really didn't have those feelings for him anymore, and feeling like, you know, it's time to break up. If the feelings are gone, you break up, right? You know how love is without Jesus? It's like, oh, I love you. Oh, no, I don't love you. I love you. Oh, no, I don't love you. I love you. And that's how it is. And so I thought that was what you did. I thought that if you really were supposed to be with someone, you would keep having those intense feelings. The brain can't manage that level of dopamine for more than a couple of years. And right around that time, it just was gone. And so it was heartbreaking. There was a lot of emotional pain that went along with it, a lot of difficulty that came into my life, a lot of insecurities that came as a result, and I'm sure he's had his wounds as well. It was the wrong way to do things, but it was the only way I knew. Then I became a Christian the first year of college. I was very involved with New Age thinking. I was meditating. I have a curvature of the spine, and 3 of the bumps on my spine are missing, so I went to a back doctor, and they said, you need to do yoga to strengthen your back. So I ended up getting involved with yoga and meditation. and starting to try to reach enlightenment. I'd been raised in kind of a nominal Christian environment, but that just wasn't doing anything for me. And then I thought, maybe I'm going to find some kind of spiritual fulfillment if I do all this meditation stuff. So I started taking meditation very seriously. In the first year of college, I was really into it, meditating all the time. I had a little terrarium next to my bed, and I would jump out of bed and sit in front of the terrarium and meditate every day. I meditated more faithfully as a non-Christian than I pray now as a Christian. It was just very, very intense. And I kept trying to find some kind of answer, through that. And dated a number of guys in college, that first year of college, but then toward the end of the first year of college, became a Christian. And then I ended up at a Seventh-day Adventist community, self-supporting ministry. What happened is I went to a fair that the school put on where they had booths of different kinds of groups that were into conservation and ecology, and a group of Adventists were there. And they were handing out plant-based samples of food. And so they had this plate of veggie burgers, and I'm a college student. I went up and wiped out the whole thing, And then they put out another plate, and I wiped that one out too. And then I noticed that they put a little sign up that said, "One only, please." So I went to the literature rack, knowing that I couldn't eat any more food. And I went to the literature rack. Now, I had become a vegetarian in high school because I believed in reincarnation. Because I had a friend who was married to this guy, or dating this guy, that was really, really into meditation and all this stuff and believed in reincarnation. And he introduced the idea of people coming back. Sometimes as animals, if they didn't do well in their life on Earth, they come back reincarnated as an animal. So during that time, my grandmother died, and I reasoned that she could come back as a cow, and I didn't want to eat her on a hamburger bun one night. And so I'm serious about this. I became a vegetarian as a result. So I'm already a vegetarian, and I'm, trying to become a Christian at this point because some college friends of mine had witnessed to me, and I meet these Adventists at this booth, and I ate all their burgers. Anyway, I went over to the literature rack and pulled the first thing I saw off of the rack, and I looked at it, and it had a combination of plant-based eating, natural living close to nature, and the Bible and the gospel and Jesus, and I knew I was home in that moment. This is what I've been looking for my whole life. And that was 45 years ago, people. Well, how old am I? Yeah, it was like almost 45 years ago. So, praise God, I ended up going to the community where those people lived a couple of times just to visit, and it was there that I first met this man named Michael Schwirzer. I ended up moving to that community, and Michael Schwirzer lived there. He was the farm manager. He grew lots of vegetables and stuff, and I did different kinds of jobs. And I went there to learn about the Adventist church and the teachings, and learn how to live that lifestyle, learn how to cook vegan and all this stuff. So this man, Michael Schwirzer, just had this gorgeous, soaring tenor voice, and he would walk down the trails singing to the top of his lungs, and he was just this amazing guy that was growing all these vegetables, and that's not usually a thing people get romanticized about, but it was very impressive to me. And I remember being, they wouldn't even let the men and women talk to each other. They were so strict. They went so far away from the world's model of doing things that they were kind of extreme. So you weren't really allowed to talk much or fraternize much or interact much with the opposite sex. But I was running a little health food store, and he came in and I remember he bought raisins and sunflower seeds, and he came up to the register to buy it, and he said to me, "How you doing?" And I was like, "Fine." And he said, "I'm praying for you." I guess that's like an Adventist bar line, kind of. But it was like, whoa, he's praying for me. Wow, So anyway, it's a long story, but he ended up being strongly impressed to pursue me, and he left. The place was in Michigan where we met, but he left and went to the West Coast, and he was doing reforestation for the U.S. Forest Service, tree planting. And he told one of his tree planting buddies, the guy was named 50, that he had an interest in me. And 50 kept saying things to him like, you need to just drive back there and find that girl. And finally got sick of hearing the guy say that, and he jumped in his truck and drove all the way across the United States in search of me, believing that God was leading him to me. Meanwhile, I had moved to a ministry in Chicago. It was a vegetarian restaurant, and I was working there, and he actually had come in a couple times, and we had talked a little bit there. I was working there, but then I went back to the place in Michigan. Then when he's en route from Montana, he's going back to Chicago thinking I'm still there, but I've left. He gets to Chicago, and he was terrified. Like, this is weird. The guy drives across the nation. He goes to this girl, I think God is leading me. I mean, it's just like outer limits kind of stuff. So he's terrified to do it. But he gets to the restaurant, and the people say, she's gone. And he's like, oh, phew. I don't have to deal with it. So he went back to the place in Michigan, and there I was. So anyway, long story short, the way that we would date then is called courtship. I don't like the word courtship because it sounds like women in pointed hats and men in tights, but that's the word they used. So I was like, okay, he asked me to court him. And I was like, I don't even know you. First of all, I was never allowed to really talk to you. But I'm not going to drag this story out too long, but to make a long story short, we ended up in a courtship, and we courted for about 6 months. Unfortunately, I had developed pretty significant anorexia as a result of being in kind of a fundamentalist extreme environment. And I was pretty low weight, and then what happened is I got a flu, and I couldn't eat for a solid week, and I went down to 85 pounds. So my parents are not used to the way that Adventists, especially fundamentalist Adventists, do things. And when he had asked me to court him, he had called my parents and said, can I court your daughter? And they were like, she's been doing whatever she wanted since she was like 12 years old, and you're asking us if you can, But they didn't understand how serious it was. So, we're in this relationship, and I get really sick with anorexia. And then I get this flu, and I go down to a really low weight. And in the midst of all that, he wants to get engaged. And they're like, what? They're freaking out. So anyway, it was really a drama. But we ended up getting married, believe it or not. I did get a little healthier after I recovered from the flu, strong enough to get married. We drove out to Montana where he was doing reforestation, and literally I would tree plant with him. I had to wash my clothes in a creek, cook over a fire, and walk up mountains that were like that to bring him trees. So I got my strength back, and I may be alive today. See, Michael had been through something very similar when he was in his search spiritually. He joined an ashram, and he ended up starving down to 120 pounds. And he ended up seeing the guru, the leader of the ashram, levitate off the ground. And he was like, this is too much, I'm out of here. He left, and he collapsed on the floor of this apartment. And a girl that knew him came and gave him chicken broth. And he came back, and he was all right. So he had known that type of thing, and he felt called by God to save my life. So this is like not an ideal situation. People should be healthy, but God works with what we've got, and so we ended up married, believe it or not. And then we're tree planting, and just being with someone that loved me that much, that was that committed to me, and then just living this very rigorous lifestyle. I got my health back, and I haven't been anorexic since. I eat potato chips and peanut butter and stuff. People with anorexia I know I'm kind of skinny looking, but I'm really not anorexic. So anyway, that's my story. Now, was it perfect the way we did it the second time? Absolutely not. It was too rigid. I didn't know him well enough. A lot of people who formed relationships out of that sort of fundamentalist approach later, they didn't make it. But by the grace of God, we did. And we've been married 40 years. And you guys can clap if you want. Okay. And I have to say, even though the courtship approach was a little too strict and rigid, and there's issues with it, I think it was an improvement on the way the world does things. So here are some of the questions you ask before you get involved with someone. Am I ready for marriage? Are they ready for marriage? And are we compatible? That compatibility issue is a hard one because opposites attract. But I think it's safe to say if someone feels called to the mission field and you want to be a brain surgeon in the States, you're not compatible. You got to have similar life plans. So we could go into detail about that. But what do I mean by ready? I would say these are some of the important points of readiness for a life partnership. Number 1, no active addiction. Number 2, debt should be resolved or nearly so. There should be no real major relationship baggage. Legal encumbrances should be resolved, and there should be basic relational maturity. If you are an abusive person, if you are a person who can't get along with your friends, if you have broken relationships everywhere you look, don't get married. The same thing will happen in your marriage. Learn how to love and be loved. That's what friendship is for, is to prepare you for a life partnership. Okay, so what about conflict within marriage? Let me share just one really practical tool that is very, very powerful that I have learned, and I'll give you a little background as to how I learned it. I had an ongoing struggle with my oldest daughter. This is many years later. I have 2 college-age kids, and my oldest daughter will come home from college, and she's a wonderful kid, and we're really close, but we're the kind of females that can go from 0 to 100, and sound like feral cats, in a matter of minutes. So we would get in this argument because she would come home and she would use dishes, dirty dishes, and leave them in the sink. Well, I have a tiny sink, tiny kitchen, so I can't do anything when the sink is full of dishes. And I'd wake up in the morning and there'd be the dishes. So I'd go in her room and I'd say, "I'm not your maid," which always went over well. And she'd say, "I'm going to do it, Mom." And I'd be like, "I need it done now," And then I would start complaining, "I feel like you don't really love me, you just think I'm here for your convenience." And I'd say these terrible things, Didn't go well. So we'd end up getting into that escalation. So this particular day, I was reading this book about marriage, and it talked about this technique where you use reflective listening to resolve conflict. So you do the exact opposite of what you're inclined to do. Now pay attention here and take this tool home with you. You do the exact opposite of what you're inclined to do. When you're frustrated with someone or in some kind of conflict, you're inclined to want to put across your agenda to them, right? I want this stuff off the floor. I want the lights turned on. It's too cold in here. It's too hot in here. Whatever. You want to get your agenda across to them. But what you do in this exercise is you take in their agenda instead of trying to get your agenda across. You do get your chance in most cases to share your agenda, but not before you hear theirs. Based on James chapter 1, verse 19, it says, "Let every man be quick to" what? Hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. So when you're quick to hear, you are slow to speak, and you are slow to wrath. But when you are slow to hear and quick to speak, you're quick to what? And you escalate. And it works like an amazing formula. It's very predictable. So what I learned is how to use reflective listening. So rather than me complaining to the other person something I don't like about what they're doing, I say, "Well, what's going on with you? I want to hear your side of the story." And you take it in and you say it back to them in your own words. That's called reflective listening. So you just take in what they say it back to them in their words. I read about that and I thought, I need to try that in my marriage. But little did I know I would get a chance to road test it with my daughter. So I went into her room, same thing happened, dishes in the sink, went into her room in the morning. "Allison, you left the dishes in the sink again. I can't function in the kitchen when you do that. Sometimes I just feel like you're made." And her shoulders went up like this, her whole body tensed. And she's a soprano, so her voice sounds like a dog whistle when she gets frustrated. And she's like, "Mom, I hate it when you say that. It just really bothers me." And then I remembered the book. Oh, what was I supposed to do? Okay, reflective listening. And I went, "So it really bothers you when I accuse you of not loving me because of something you do that irritates me?" And literally she went, "Yeah." And I was like, and you want me to believe that you love me even though you do things that I'm not happy with. Is that right? "Yeah, Mom." And we'd start having a conversation about the whole thing, and we were able to resolve it. It's really, really powerful tool. So when you're in a conflict situation with your spouse, it can go around and around and around like a hamster wheel. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Where one person reacts and the other person reacts to that person's reaction, and then that person reacts to that person's reaction, and pretty soon you don't know where your reaction ends and theirs begins. It feels like it takes on a life of its own. You know what I'm saying? So at any time, as you can see in this illustration, you can go vertical and just back out of the situation and pray to Jesus. One of those Nehemiah prayers, God help me, I want to have a happy marriage. This isn't working. And then you can gather your thoughts, and instead of you advancing your own agenda, you can say back to them what you are hearing them say. And I challenge you to try that. It's extremely, extremely powerful.
This podcast is brought to you by the Jacksonville First Seventh-day Adventist Church. Connect with us on www.jaxsda.org or on Facebook and YouTube. We look forward to sharing more inspiring messages with you.